Дорогая церковь Вифания, приветствую вас словами «Мир вам». Слава Богу, что мы можем в еще один день, в еще одно воскресенье собраться так все вместе. Мы видим Божью милость, что мы можем и больше вместе собираться. Нам уже позволяют чуть-чуть больше, и слава Богу за это, что мы можем так все вместе собираться с друг другом в воскресенье. И сегодня моя тема проповедь называется «Фокус на креста», по-английски «Focus». И я хочу прочитать место Писания от Матфея. Мы все знаем эту историю, когда Иисус послал своих учеников, чтобы плыть на море Галилейское. И мы все знаем, что они попали в такой шторм, сильный шторм. И сами даже не знали, если они доплывут до конца. И мы видим, что Иисус в середине ночи приходит и ходит по морю. И я хочу вот на эту историю посмотреть, как Петр проявил такой фокус на креста, где он доверил, но не полностью. И пришло, что он начал ходить, но в одно время увидел все, что вокруг происходит, и начал тонуть. И я хочу вот просто некоторые мысли от этой истории сегодня поговорить вместе с нами. Моя проповедь будет по-английски сегодня, но я хотел просто дать вам контекст чуть-чуть, о чем я буду говорить сегодня. And just like that, brothers and sisters, again, good morning. It's very great to see all of you this morning. I'm very happy to be with all of you. And as you probably already understood, we're going to be looking at the story of Peter and the disciples out in the ocean, in the Sea of Galilee, and what happened with Peter when he had lost his focus on Christ, when he had for just a moment lost his focus in what situation that he happened to fall on. And again, of all the stories in the New Testament, this is probably one of those that outline the importance of focus and faith. And there's nothing more that outlines it better than this story of Peter and the disciples and Jesus out on the water. And it's a story that most of us has probably heard many times and have read it many times, and your kids have probably already know it by heart from learning it in Sunday school. But I just want to take a closer look at Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. And again, the title of my sermon this morning is called Keep Your Focus, or Keep Your Focus on Christ. Focus is very critical in many aspects of our lives. You know, what would happen if while you were driving your car out on the road and you lost focus for just a few brief moments of the road in front of you? Or what would happen if you were preparing food, you know, for lunch, or cutting some vegetables, cutting some meat with a sharp knife, and you just got distracted for just a few seconds? Or what would happen if you were working and you were hammering nails, and just for a moment you lost focus of the task that was in front of you? In any of those cases, you are more than likely to mess up at best, and at worst, you could end up in the hospital, in the emergency room, you know, worrying about paying your deductible for the mistake that just happened. You know, when you are dealing with a dangerous task, whether you're chopping with a knife or driving a car or using a hammer and nails, you want to stay focused so that you can do the job well and safely. And Jesus here had a powerful lesson to teach his disciples that night on the Sea of Galilee, that your faith, like every component of your life, needs focus, and it needs all of your focus. You know, without focus, you can't have that full faith. Faith's most basic definition is trust. But if your trust is scattered all over the place in many different directions, it doesn't actually trust in anyone or anything fully. And Jesus urges us to keep our faith's true focus. So let's read Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33 before we dive in. Again, Matthew chapter 14, starting at verse 22, all the way to 33. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake, while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid." He said, "Take courage, I am here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. Just to bring some biblical context to this text, just to freshen up a little bit, the background of the story is that Jesus and the disciples are now on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and it's late in the day, and just before this happened, they had just performed a great miracle of feeding 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And understandably amazed and just amazed by the miracle that just took place, the people wanted to make Jesus king right there. But Jesus, knowing that their enthusiasm and excitement was shallow, refused them and instead goes off to pray by himself. And after dismissing the crowd, he sends the disciples on ahead to meet them on the other side of the sea, telling them that he would meet them later. And Matthew in his writing tells the disciples again this way: immediately Jesus made the disciples go into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. He tells them to get into the boat and to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And he was finally able to spend some time alone in prayer. But the disciples, however, didn't have such a refreshing or relaxing night, so you could say. A storm came up and kept them from reaching land, reaching from where they were supposed to go. And fighting all night long, they were fighting against high winds and high waves, and they couldn't get to the other side of the sea. Even though Jesus told them to go, the storm kept them from obeying him. Now, the disciples originally were probably more than likely hesitant to leave Jesus in the first place, but with the way that this is written, it shows us that Jesus commanded them to go in the boat and go. They were in God's will and yet faced trouble that led to them being exhausted and ultimately in fear. In other words, you could say Jesus led them into the storm, but he was not surprised by it. He knew it was coming, and yet he sent the disciples anyhow. Storms aren't designed to destroy us. Storms are designed to perfect us. They come to make us better and not worse. They come to strengthen us, not weaken us. And now these were experienced fishermen who were struggling to keep the boat headed in the right direction. These are men who constantly find themselves out in the water fishing for fish. With all their knowledge and all their experience at sailing, they were still struggling to survive, to keep the boat from completely sinking. And Jesus was able to pour out his heart to his heavenly Father in prayer for what seems to be a lengthy period of time. As the next time we see Jesus and the disciples together again, it comes around, as we read, around 3 o'clock or so in the morning. And that is just before the morning. So the disciples were struggling from 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., midnight, 1, 2 a.m., deep into the night. After hours of exhausting work, the disciples were stuck in the middle of this lake, of this sea, dirty, drenched, freezing cold, and worried to the point where maybe they even began to wonder, are we even going to survive this? Are we even going to make it to the shore alive? Have you ever maybe experienced some sort of similar feeling in your life, like the disciples found themselves here, in a situation where maybe you weren't even sure whether you were going to make it out of it? Perhaps a health worry or a terrible accident that has happened. You were not sure if you were going to make it out at all. But here's the good news. In Mark, we read in Mark chapter 6, verse 48, "And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the fourth watch of the night he cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them." While Jesus was praying, he still had his eyes on the disciples. While he was secluded, he still watched over his disciples while they were in this storm. And after praying for them, Jesus came down from the mountain, and he could see the difficulty that they were facing out in the middle of that sea. The eyes of the Lord are upon you and I when we encounter one of life's storms in our lives. And it may seem that maybe no one even notices the things that you are going through, but you can rest easy knowing that Jesus sees it all. He sees and he knows and he cares. And while the disciples are fighting the wind and the waves, they see something out on the water. And not just something, but they see someone. And their first initial reaction is they think that they're seeing a ghost. For what else could be standing on top of stormy waters like this but a spirit? If they weren't scared by the storm at this point, they were probably definitely rocked to their core by seeing some figure on top of the water. We read, it says, "During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said, and cried out in fear." It was sometime during this 3, 4, 5 in the morning that Jesus began walking on the water. We don't know how he did it, but he did it. And we don't doubt it either. Because after all, Jesus is the Lord of earth and heaven. He's the Lord of the natural and the supernatural. Walking on water would not be something difficult for the Son of God. And as the disciples are being rocked around by this storm, as they're shaking with fear at this thing that they see out in the water, Jesus brings comfort by focusing their faith. It's Jesus, but it shouldn't surprise them to see Jesus on the water because he is God. When the disciples saw him walking, they were terrified. And wouldn't we be terrified in the same situation? The disciples, after many, many hours of exhaustion, they're just dead tired. Their muscles are aching. The wind is howling around them. It's been raining nonstop for hours on end. Cold and tired, more than likely maybe a little bit grumpy, a little bit frustrated and hungry. And suddenly they see this figure walking out on the water. I think in any situation, we would even maybe think we must be hallucinating or seeing something that's out there. And I would think my first thought wouldn't even necessarily be, here comes Jesus. Why would he decide to walk on water in the middle of this strong storm that's going on in the middle of the night? But Jesus calls out over the storm, "Don't be afraid, it's me." He says, "Don't be afraid, take heart, take courage, I am here." The Lord continues to be the I am for us as well. We may feel like our lives are a stormy sea sometimes, and we're being buffeted by waves in every direction, just as the disciples' boat was at that time. We may well be in great danger or trouble at points in our lives and filled with tiredness and weariness and worrying whether we're going to get out of it. But Jesus comes to us in the middle of all that torment. He sees all of it that's going on and says, "Take courage, don't be afraid, I am." And no matter what disaster comes, our faith can focus on Jesus. Here, as we continue to read, this is where the text kind of takes an interesting turn. And you think Jesus walking on the water was the highlight, but there's still something that Peter does. And Peter, as the adventurous disciple, took the opportunity to focus on Jesus and reasoned with himself that if Jesus was able to walk on the water, surely Jesus could let me walk on the water as well. And he said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." So even though Jesus tried to reassure them, Peter makes really a questionable suggestion. "Lord, if it is you, command me to come on the water." Why wouldn't Peter ask, Lord, if it is you, please stop the storm from continuing, or please get us across to the other side of the land safely. Instead, he asks, Lord, if it is you, allow me to come on the water as well. And at this point, Peter isn't being arrogant in any sort of way. It's not as if he just jumps out of the boat the moment he sees Jesus and starts walking. That would have been very foolish. But it makes it clear that Matthew is very clear that Peter asks for permission first. If Jesus says no, then Peter stays in the boat. But he didn't say no. He said, come. So Peter came. And how can we really criticize him for that either? When Jesus tells us to come, you'd better obey. When he says to walk, you walk. When he says to stop, you stop. When he says to wait, you wait. In Peter's case, he was safer out on the water than in the boat at that moment. And at that moment, the smartest thing that Peter could do was to get out of his seat, stand up, and get close to as Jesus as possible, because they were about to sink altogether in the boat. Now, don't get me wrong, this morning I'm not saying that we shouldn't turn to Jesus when we're afraid. But what I'm saying is that sometimes faith means sticking it out with the disciples on the boat. Sometimes faith means holding to what Jesus tells us to do, even if it means heading into a storm. Sometimes faith means supporting each other when we're afraid and trusting that Jesus will meet us wherever we're going. And sometimes faith just means recognizing that God is God, Jesus is Jesus, and we are not. Jesus walks on water. We don't. But sometimes faith means staying in the boat together, which is where Jesus told Peter to be in the first place. Now you can see in your mind this picture of Peter crawling out of the boat and walking on water, firm as ground, toward Jesus. I'm not sure how it happened, but the water held him up, and he walked up right to him, focused on Jesus. All is well. He trusts Jesus to make this happen. His faith was focused in that moment on Jesus alone. He wasn't focused on the storm around him. He wasn't worried about the waves, the wind, the rain, everything that was going on. All he knew at that moment was that this was his Savior in front of him, and he is the one who can do anything. What does Peter have to be afraid of when Jesus is with him? But when we're told that Peter saw the wind, he took his eyes off the Savior, let his faith lose focus, and looked around him. And could you imagine the scene that he was seeing? At that brief moment, he's focused on Jesus, doesn't see anything around, but the second he starts to realize what's going around him, he sees the storm, he sees the waves, the wind, the crashing rain. And I'm sure what was going through his mind is, what am I doing? What am I trying to do? I'm going to get hurt, or worse, maybe even die and drown. The waves were too much, the wind was too strong. And at that moment, when he started to lose his focus, he began to sink. And he could have drowned. Everything goes fine until Peter notices the storm all around him. And remember, during all this, the storm still has never stopped. During all of this was transpiring before the disciples and Peter and Jesus, the storm is still going on around him. But the wind was there all along. We read in verse 32 that the wind doesn't die down until Jesus and Peter get in the boat. We all can get distracted many times in our lives and lose our focus, especially when storms of life rage all around us. We never know what we're headed into, day in and day out. We see that things can change so quickly and so fast. And it's not easy to always keep our eyes on Jesus in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a raging rain. When there's fear and you begin to feel overwhelmed and anxious, this text reminds us that not only does Christ control the storm, and not only does he send the storm, but he reveals himself in the middle of the storm. Very often our purest vision of Christ comes when the storm of life is at its worst and is about to capsize the boat, or in other words, capsize our faith. And so what do we do then? Pray for concentrating faith, or pray that we stay focused during the storm? What we do is we focus our eyes on Jesus. We focus our eyes on the Son of God. Today, the sun is shining. Today, life is good. Today, Lord is blessing us abundantly, and we have everything that we could ever ask for and more. Tomorrow, it can all be taken away, and it can all be gone in a matter of minutes, if not seconds. And what happens then? Does our focus still stay on Jesus during the bad times, just as it does during the good times? For a brief moment, Peter forgot about Jesus and remembered where he is. He's Peter, a fisherman who belongs back in the boat. And in that instant, he looks down at his feet and sees nothing but water underneath. That it's impossible. When he lost his focus, he began to sink. Brothers and sisters, I just wanted to leave us with a reminder this morning. As we head into a new year, as we see that although we leave behind a difficult year, the Lord still had abundantly blessed us. We still had food on our tables. We had a roof over our head. We were protected. But as we head into another year, uncertain of who knows what could happen, I just wanted to remind us and remind myself to continue to keep my focus on Jesus. No matter the storm, no matter if it's a sunny day, or if it looks like we're about to capsize and the boat's about to go under, that we understand that Jesus, he sends the storm, he allows it to happen, but he's also there present the entire time, watching over us and keeping his eye on us throughout it. And let this story of Peter be a reminder to us to never lose our focus so that we never ever end up sinking away. With that, brothers and sisters, I would just like us to stand and finish off in prayer.